We're going to get started with 18.6 today. We're skipping 18.5, so that won't be on the test. And the chapter review this week won't have any questions from 18.5. Last section we're doing for chapter 18, then we're going to start to review for the test, and that'll be on Monday next week. Okay, so 18.6 today. It's about bacterial disease antibiotics. Understanding bacteria is necessary to prevent or treat disease. So as you know, bacteria causes disease. Some do. Most bacteria actually are good for us. Some bacteria make vitamins in our intestine. Some bacteria fight off bad bacteria. Some bacteria can release nutrients and minerals back into the soil for plants and also in our intestine as well. So a lot of bacteria is very useful for us. Some can be used in so the acidophilus bacteria eats milk to produce yogurt. Other bacteria is used to make cheese. So a lot of bacteria is beneficial for us, but as we know, some bacteria will cause disease. And so understanding how that works and ways to kill that bacteria is important. So there's two ways that bacteria can cause disease. The first way is by attacking cells. So this shows you tuberculosis in the lungs, and the bacteria is in blue on here. And the bacteria eats away the lung. So the orange right here is lung cells, and the blue bacteria eats it away. So in tuberculosis, one sign of tuberculosis is when you cough up blood. Because the bacteria have eaten away the lung lining, it causes the lungs to bleed. And so that's one sign of tuberculosis, is bleeding from coughing. So the bacteria that causes tuberculosis is called Mycobacteria tuberculosis. The other way that bacteria can cause disease is by making toxins. And the bacteria on here, shown in purple, Clostridium botulinum, makes a toxin that can be deadly for us. It's a neurotoxin, and so it causes the nerves not to function properly. So it can look like you're drunk if you have this infection. The toxin will interfere with your nerves working properly, which will cause you not to be able to walk straight. You can't think clearly or talk well. So this toxin will eat away your nerves. And if it's not treated, it is deadly. This can be in some foods. It's very rare, only a handful of deaths per year. But so it's not anything to worry about. But it is something that is very serious if it does happen and can be fatal if not treated. Now there are treatments for it though. So if this is something that happens to somebody, there are ways to get rid of the toxin, but it is a very serious infection. Did you all get that down? Okay. So what is a toxin? It's a poison that's released by an organism. So certain bacteria and viruses can release poisons into the body. Okay, so a common bacteria that you'll find in the human body is Staphylococcus aureus. And this is found usually in the nose, nasal linings. And usually it's harmless if it stays in that area. About 20% of people have this in their body at any one time, and it doesn't harm them. But it can be harmful if it's transferred to food. So if somebody blows their nose and they're not sick, they just have allergies, but they blow their nose, they might have this bacteria living in their nose naturally, and they don't wash their hands, and then they touch, say a spoon and to the food, and somebody else eats from that spoon, then they can get sick from that bacteria. They can transfer that bacteria from their nose to another person, and that can cause food poisoning. So that's why it's important to wash your hands, even if you're not sick and you have allergies. It's still very important to wash your hands after blowing your nose, because even if you're not sick, you can still have bacteria that can be harmful to other people. Now, most commonly, you get food poisoning through Staphylococcus from foods that have already been cooked and then set out without being refrigerated. So, one common example is potato salad. When you bring potato salad to a picnic, it stays outside for a while and it should be refrigerated. But if it stays out for a couple of hours and warms up to room temperature, then that's a good place for bacteria to grow. And the reason why it grows so well in potato salad is that it's not very acidic. A lot of foods that we eat are acidic, and the acid kills the bacteria. Mayonnaise is quite acidic, and so mayonnaise on its own would kill bacteria pretty well. But potatoes will neutralize the acid in the mayonnaise, making it not very acidic and making it a good place for bacteria to grow. And so that's why potato salad is a common source of food poisoning. If it's not refrigerated, bacteria can grow pretty well. As long as it stays refrigerated, though, the bacteria don't really grow. It's not a problem. So I mentioned this earlier on the slide, Clostridium botulinum. So that's the bacteria that can cause food poisoning that can be deadly. And again, it's not very common, but one way it can be transferred is through cans that have been dented like this. And if you have that bacteria in the food, then you can get botulism, which is food poisoning that's caused by Clostridium botulinum. The most common way that you get it is by improper canning. So either when they canned the food, they had the spores in there and they didn't treat it properly. So when they can things, they're supposed to have a very high temperature for a given amount of time to kill any bacteria that could be on the food. But if they don't do that for the right amount of time, the bacteria could survive and stay in there, in which case you could get the food poisoning that way. But again, that's not very common. Factories know how to sterilize the food so you don't get it through the factories. If you were to get it through canned food, it would be if it were dented afterwards. So if you have, especially around the seam right here, if you have a dent like this, you shouldn't use it, because there could be a hole in here that allows air to get in. And if it's not airtight, then the bacteria can start to grow, in which case you could get food poisoning from that. So if you see dents in a can, or if you see the can bulging, that could be a sign of bacterial growth, because if it bulges, then bacteria have grown in there. They produced a gas, which makes the can bulge. So those are signs to look out for. But as long as the can is indented and not bulging, it's a pretty good sign that it's very safe and nothing to worry about. So the bacteria that you get through botulism makes a toxin that can be deadly if not treated. We do have treatment for it though, but if it's caught in time, you can get an antitoxin that deactivates the toxin. But again, this is not a very common food poisoning source. The most common is the Staphylococcus, as I talked about before, which comes from the nose. And that's the common source of food poisoning. And most of the foods that you get food poisoning from are vegetables, because those ones usually aren't cooked, they're out in the open, they're not always washed. And so that by far is the easiest way to get food poisoning. So as I mentioned, in your nose, most people have Staphylococcus in their nose and it's not hurting them. But bacteria can travel to another place of the body and become destructive. And one example of that would be impetigo. Impetigo is what we see in this picture right here. So you get the sore on your face or other parts of the body. But basically, it looks like a yellow gold scab that forms. And this can be from staph bacteria or strep bacteria that has transferred to an open wound. So if bacteria stay in one place in your body, they're not harming the body. But if you have an open wound and they can transfer to the open wound, they can start to destroy the tissues in there, the muscles, the fat, in which case you get a sore like you see on here. So if they spread to places they're not usually supposed to be, like the fat or the muscles, they can cause severe injury, like you see in this picture. So this is called necrotizing fasciitis, and it's flesh-eating bacteria. This is bacteria that, again, normally is not harmful to the body. It's bacteria that usually are on the skin or in the nose and don't do anything to the body. But if you have an open wound and they jump to that area, they can get into the fat, the muscles, then they can destroy those tissues, as you can see in this picture. So that's why it's always important to clean wounds, even if it looks like it's a clean area. You might have bacteria on your skin already that could be causing infection. Now, thankfully, this is very rare. Necrotizing fasciitis is not a very common thing, and it can be true with antibiotics. In severe cases, they have to do amputation, but that's a last resort, and many times they can treat it with antibiotics before it gets to that point. So this could be caused, again, through just an open wound. It could be caused through things like a tick bite, a spider bite. But anytime you have an open area, bacteria can come in and colonize an area they're not usually supposed to be in, which can cause problems. So the things I just talked about, impetigo, necrotizing fasciitis, and strep throat, those are all caused by Streptococcus bacteria. And strep throat, you can see on here, the tonsils become inflamed during strep throat. So on this left-hand side, you see a normal mouth, and on the right-hand side, you see a swollen tonsil right here. So some signs of a strep throat would be a swollen tonsil, and you see white patches or white spots. So these are all different strains of Streptococcus, but Streptococcus can cause a wide variety of infections. And so you don't need to write this down just for information, but this shows you some things that bacteria can cause. So acne can be from bacteria. It tells you the kind of bacteria that causes acne. Anthrax, I mentioned anthrax last week or the week before. It's a pretty rare infection. It's found sometimes in soil. If you breathe it in, it can cause trouble breathing, it causes a fever. Lyme disease is spread through ticks. Tetanus is spread through, getting an open wound on a dirty area, which many times it can be through rusty nails, but not necessarily. It can be anything that you've cut yourself on that's dirty. And tetanus can be very dangerous and life-threatening if not treated. But we do have a vaccine for tetanus, and most everybody gets a vaccine in childhood. So tetanus is generally nothing to worry about because we usually have vaccines for it, and so you're immune to it. But if not treated, it can be very serious or fatal. It causes muscle spasms, it can cause paralysis. Bacteria that cause tooth decay or cavities. So the way to treat bacterial infections is antibiotics. These are chemicals that can kill or slow the growth of bacteria. Antibiotics are found usually through fungus. The first one, penicillin, was a fungus that they discovered that created a chemical that killed bacteria. Now, penicillin is one kind of fungus. Other kinds of fungus also make antibiotics, but that was the first one. And it's still used to this day. So if a medicine ends in "illin," it's an antibiotic, amoxicillin, for example. So anytime it ends in "illin," that's that's indication that it's antibiotic. They work by making the bacteria not have a cell wall. And the cell wall is a protection for the cell, and it keeps water and nutrients inside the cell. So without a cell wall, the bacteria really, they can't function. They can't keep the nutrients they need inside. They can't keep the water they need inside, and they're going to dissolve pretty quickly. Now, viruses don't have a cell wall, so antibiotics can't work on the virus. The bacteria, you can see, do have cell walls. It's in teal right here, but viruses don't have cell walls, and so it's ineffective on them. So if you have a viral infection, say cold or flu, then the doctor can't really do much for that. They can't really give you much medicine for that because there's really no good treatment to kill a cold virus or a flu virus. Tamiflu sometimes can be used to kill a flu virus, but for the most part, we don't have good antiviral medication. Usually your body is the best defense against viruses. Bacteria, though, is a different story. For bacteria, we do have medication, antibiotics that can come in and kill the bacteria. So bacteria over time have been gaining resistance to antibiotics. They are able to transfer a gene that makes them resistant to antibiotics. You can see in this picture right here, this one bacteria here has a plasmid, this circle right here, and that has a gene for resistance. And it can transfer that gene to other bacteria that don't have it. So you can see down here, these bacteria don't have that gene, but they can sense that. And the bacteria that have the gene can transfer it to other bacteria that don't have it. And over time, the whole colony will be immune to that antibiotic. So I mentioned this last week, conjugation is the process where they make a tube And that tube is able to transfer the plasmid across. And so one bacteria will copy this plasmid and then give a copy to the other bacteria through the conjugation tube. And that will continue until the whole colony has the same gene. And it can be genes for, thickness of the cell wall. It could be a gene for, faster flagella. They can move faster with a longer tail. It could be a gene for antibiotic resistance. So it could be a lot of different things they have, but these are good traits the bacteria will transfer to each other. So this happens in several ways. We can cause this to happen by overusing antibiotics. So if we use too many antibiotics, then we'll have more bacteria that can get immune to the antibiotics that we use. This can happen through underuse too. And if you are given antibiotics and you're told to take it for 10 days, you take it for, say, 7 days, and then you stop taking it, then you could have killed the weak bacteria, but not the strong bacteria. And then the strong bacteria start to multiply, and your body is overrun with strong bacteria, and which makes it even worse than it was before. So it's important to take the full dose of antibiotics because that will ensure you've killed all the bacteria. Taking just half the dose, for a few days instead of the whole 7 or 10 days will cause stronger bacteria to grow, in which case your body will just be full of strong bacteria, which will be harder to kill in the future. Also through misuse. So some farmers give their cows or pigs antibiotics because they actually grow bigger with antibiotics. We're not quite sure how that works, but we think that possibly that antibiotics can kill bacteria in your intestines and cause other bacteria to come in, which will then make the pigs and cows get fatter. It can happen for humans too. If you change the bacteria in your intestines, it can change the nutrients you take in and the nutrients you don't take in, which could change things like your weight, your mood, your health. So farmers who give antibiotics to their cows or their pigs, their chickens, will then transfer the antibiotics to us. We eat the meat and we get those antibiotics too, which can then over time cause strong bacteria to form that are immune to the antibiotics. So I mentioned this before, so overuse, if you use it too much, then you can get bacteria that are immune to antibiotics because they will transfer these genes to their other bacterial neighbors, in which case they will all have the same gene. Underuse, don't take the full dose. You might only destroy the weakest bacteria and keep the strongest ones in your body. And then misuse, when it's fed to animals to make them fatter. But thankfully, we didn't know about these dangers even 20, 30 years ago, and now we're much more aware of these dangers. And so doctors and farmers are more careful about this. And so hopefully that will help stem this tide of having antibiotics cause these super colonies of bacteria that are immune to antibiotics. We use a lot more sparingly now. Now we don't use antibiotics unless we really need to. One consequence is MRSA, and MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Methicillin is one kind of antibiotic, and MRSA is an infection, also called staph infection, of a certain kind of bacteria that is immune to methicillin. And so it's hard to treat because methicillin is what we commonly use to treat staph infections, and this bacteria is immune to it. So a staph infection causes a sore, it can be oozing, it can be under the surface, and the bacteria basically just eat away the tissue. There's also VRSA, which stands for vancomycin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So both these strains, these are both staph infections, and both these strains are immune to certain antibiotics. They're not impossible to treat, but they are quite difficult to treat because we have to use different medicine than we're used to kill these bacteria. Any questions about that before we go on? Okay. Homework today is 18.6. It's on page 531. Work on questions 1 through 6. And then tomorrow we're going to start doing the chapter review. And we're going to review all through this week and have the test on Monday.
Miss Holly?
Yes, Emma?
So sorry. On number 5, I couldn't find the 2 reasons.
Let's see, for number 5, what 2 reasons? So we talked about today about conjugation, right? So bacteria can transfer genes through conjugation. So if one bacteria has a gene for resistance, it can transfer to the whole colony pretty fast that way.
Mm-hmm.
So that'd be one reason. And the other reason is that bacteria divide very fast, and because of that, they can mutate very quickly as well. So there can be lots of mutations in the colony pretty quickly, which can be good for the bacteria. It can be a mutation for resistance to antibiotics.
Okay.
Once
Would
that
that also
mutation,
be?
oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Would that also be like superbugs or no?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Superbugs are bacteria that are immune to antibiotics.
Okay. Thank you so much. That I couldn't find it. Okay. Bye.
Bye. Have a good day.
You too.